Hello and welcome to my channel, Rhino here. Today, I remembered that I made a video a while ago on Creation Ministries International's 15 Questions for Evolutionists series, in which I said I'd respond to more of their videos in that series, and then promptly forgot all about them. To reiterate, I will not be covering the series in its entirety, but I will cover a few of their questions. This one is question number 6. How do evolutionists know that living things were not designed? So let's go!
And we're looking at question number 6 out of our pamphlet, 15 Questions for Evolutionists. And we're going to give you the question, then we're going to give you the responses that skeptics have written in
We've
to
got
our
some responses
to our
from these, yes.
And then we'll respond to those and show once again how very difficult for evolutionists to give good responses to these questions.
Okay, but as I pointed out when I first responded to this series, the difficulty one has in figuring out the answer to a question does not have anything to do with the accuracy of that answer. And if the last video was any indication, you're not getting these answers from experts in a relevant field, you're getting them from lay people. So if a layperson can't adequately explain something scientific, that doesn't actually mean anything.
So here it is. Question number 6 in the pamphlet is this. Living things look like they were designed. So how do evolutionists know that they weren't designed?
Mainly because the appearance of design is purely superficial. As soon as you get into the nitty-gritty, it becomes obvious not only that we weren't designed, but if it actually turned out that we were designed, that designer didn't know what they were doing.
Richard Dawkins wrote, "Biology is the study of complicated things that have the appearance of having been designed with a purpose."
Yes, that is a quote from the first page of the first chapter of Dawkins' book, The Blind Watchmaker. Do you know what comes immediately after that quote? 11 chapters explaining why the appearance of design is superficially satisfying but ultimately deceptive. This is akin to the eye quote from Darwin. It's taken from the beginning of his chapter explaining how the eye likely evolved. You take advantage of the fact that it is good practice when refuting an argument to start off by hypothetically granting it before going through exactly what the problems are.
Francis Crick, the co-discoverer of the double helix structure of DNA, wrote, "Biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they see was not designed, but rather evolved." They've just got to tuck it up there.
Yes, Crick wrote that in his 1988 book, What Mad Pursuits. But let's have it in its entirety, shall we? What is found in biology is mechanisms. Mechanisms built with chemical components that are often modified by other, later mechanisms added to the earlier ones. While Occam's razor is a useful tool in the physical sciences, it can be a very dangerous implement in biology. It is thus very rash to use simplicity and elegance as a guide in biological research. While DNA could be claimed to be both simple and elegant, it must be remembered that DNA almost certainly originated fairly close to the origin of life when things were necessarily simple or they would not have got going. Biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they see was not designed, but rather evolved. It might be thought, therefore, that evolutionary arguments would play a large part in guiding biological research, but this is far from the case. It is difficult enough to study what is happening now. To figure out exactly what happened in evolution is even more difficult. Thus, evolutionary achievements can be used as hints to suggest possible lines of research, but it is highly dangerous to trust them too much. It is all too easy to make mistaken inferences unless the process involved is already very well understood. This is in the conclusion of the book, where he is talking about how biology differs from the other sciences. For instance, physics has laws that are likely the same everywhere in the universe, but biology has broad generalizations which usually have a few exceptions. In this particular paragraph, he seems to be warning against speculation as to why certain features evolved the way they did, because such speculations are just that, speculations. This would be like saying, the human brain started getting bigger because they started eating more calorie-dense foods like meat. Sure, it's possible that that was a contributing factor given how energy-hungry our brains are, but we can't actually be sure of the causal relationship there. So, rather than this being an admission that biologists start with evolutionary presuppositions, as is being suggested here, that was actually an admonition against speculative guesses about evolutionary history.
The problem for evolutionists is that living things show too much design.
Superficially, maybe, but there are just so many things going on in our bodies, and not just ours, but other organisms too, that just don't make any sense in light of intelligent design. Was it a good design to give most primates the necessary genetic material to produce vitamin C, but slightly broken so that they can't actually produce it, instead needing to obtain it through diet? And if everything were specially designed, that is, there's no evolutionary relationship, then why would they be designed in such a way that when we use different methods to map evolutionary relationships, they agree with each other to high levels of accuracy? Back to the design flaws, our breathing tubes share an orifice with our eating tubes, allowing them to fatally clog. Our waste-expelling orifices are too close to our reproductive bits, and in the case of penises, the waste-expelling orifice is the same as the reproductive one. I can wiggle my ears using muscles that, in our ancestors, would have swiveled our ears to point towards sounds, but now in humans serves as no more than a trick to amuse children. The recurrent laryngeal nerve, the development of legs in snake embryos. I could go on.
Who objects when an archaeologist says that pottery points to human design, yet if someone attributes the design in living things to a designer, that's not acceptable?
The thing with that is that we have actually seen humans making pottery. We have never seen a god design life, so we know that pottery comes from humans from experience. So if you can show me an example of a god designing something that we can observe, then maybe you can make this case. Until then, you're going to be stuck trying to explain away all the evidence of bad design.
Why should science be restricted to naturalistic causes rather than logical causes?
Because logic is the realm of philosophy, not science. I mean, sure, science has its basis in philosophy, but logical or philosophical argumentation is not the same as the scientific method. And I'm not saying that to denigrate logical argumentation, that's just how it works. Science is more about predictions. Make a prediction about what will happen in some set of circumstances, then set up those circumstances to see if your prediction is correct. Positing an explanation other than natural explanations wouldn't really work for this, as how would you even go about testing that? Like this whole design thing, sure, you could construct a logically coherent argument that could conclude with therefore biological systems were intelligently designed, but being logically coherent does not mean it is actually true. Instead, we need to make predictions about what would be expected if a system were designed, and then to take into consideration what type of designer is being suggested. In the case of young Earth creationism, they usually want the designer to be an all-knowing, all-powerful, and benevolent being known as God. So there would be a few predictions that are made by the idea of this type of creator. One would be that the design is flawless. Since there are many flaws, this then demonstrates that we were not created by such a creator. Now, you could take benevolent out of the mix if you want to. The creator gave us a spine that pretty much guarantees back problems later in life because he enjoys watching us suffer. But in my experience, creationists don't usually like this option.
Why should science be restricted to naturalistic causes rather than logical causes?
Because you don't figure out how to build a smartphone by arguing logically. You do it by making predictions, testing those predictions, and using those results to refine the technology. I don't understand why this is such a hard concept for you to figure out. Like, premise 1, the battery on my phone lasts 12 hours. Premise 2, if I increase the capacity of the battery, it will last longer. Premise 3, people want their phone batteries to last longer. Premise 4, people do not want their phone batteries to be larger than they are now. Conclusion, we should make a phone with a larger capacity but similarly sized battery. There, you have a logical syllogism that gets you to a better battery. Now, did that help anyone actually make this better battery? No? Well, then that answers your question. And, of course, this is also ignoring the fact that you seem to be assuming that logic is somehow not natural. Scientists do use logic when designing their experiments and figuring out the predictions. I think you're just trying to get people to jump to the supernatural explanations without just coming right out and saying supernatural. You're trying to do it by implication instead.
Shouldn't logic dictate where we go rather than limiting it to naturalism and censoring out any explanation that isn't naturalistic?
Okay. Find me a logical argument that somehow improves our lives in the same way that science has, that doesn't have its grounds in naturalism. Go ahead, I'll wait.
Sounds like a religious
It's
overtone
going down
to
that road,
yeah.
isn't it? Yes. Yeah.
No, it is literally the opposite of going down that road.
Okay, answer number 1. Here we've got obviously responses to this question, question number 6, like we had to the other responses. Here it is. They don't. But to say that there are is a mere argument from ignorance.
It's not necessarily an argument from ignorance, but it is certainly an unjustified conclusion.
So they look like they were designed. They don't.
Well, the evolutionists don't know if they were designed, that they weren't designed. But if you say they are designed, that's an argument from ignorance.
No, what that person was getting at was that they don't think that organisms appear designed. And really, this brings up another problem with this whole thing. The appearance of design is necessarily subjective in nature. You can't decide for me what I think looks designed, and I can't decide the same for you. Their second point, that it is merely the argument from ignorance, relies on the creationists going farther into the claim, with the whole DNA is so amazing we don't know how it could have originated, therefore it must have been designed thing. That is an extrapolation of the argument, and one that I'm sure you're going to avoid here, but it is definitely something that happens.
Right, yeah.
Right?
And this was also stated in part one in the argument, but design is based on what we do know. We know, when we look at things, we can tell that things have been designed.
But how do we tell when things have been designed? It's not just the presence of complexity. There are many complex things that are not designed by anything other than the laws of physics, like the intricate crystalline structures of a snowflake, the giant fusion reactor in the sky that keeps the Earth warm and powered up. Pretty much any rock formation has a complex geologic history involving many interactions between many different geologic systems. My point is, complexity does not necessarily indicate design. And yeah, I can picture the creationist rebuttal. Those aren't complex systems that are working together to achieve something specific. But really, unless you presuppose a designer who wants life, neither is biology. Biology is just a cascade of chemical reactions when you break it down. Sure, there is a gestalt there, with our consciousness able to experience things as a singular whole organism despite being made up of a bunch of individual organisms who themselves don't seem to have experiences, but the existence of a gestalt is, again, not necessarily indicative of a designer. After all, humans have thus far been unable to create anything with the same degree of self-awareness as we currently have, praise the future robot overlords. So we don't even know what a designed consciousness would even look like, as we don't have an example of such a thing to reference. I mean, you could argue that we do, our consciousness, but that argument ends up being rather circular.
And any of you watching the program, you know design when you see it.
By intuition. Yeah, that's a great way to figure things out. Back in 2018, I found a leaf whose stem got stuck in the snow. The wind blew it, but since it was stuck, it just spun around in circles. This created a pretty well perfect circle in the snow. So perfect that, had I seen it without the leaf, I would immediately assume that somebody had made it on purpose. And yet, because I saw it with the leaf still stuck there, I was able to recognize that it was just some random event that ended up with a perfect circle in the snow. So, had I seen it without the leaf, my intuition would have been entirely wrong about it having been designed. And yet, you want to appeal to this obviously flawed intuition in order to argue for the existence of a designer for the universe? That seems unjustified, to say the least.
Well, right off the bat, there's a problem here, isn't there? If evolutionists are saying, well, we don't know whether it's designed or whether it's not designed or not, they're arguing from an argument from ignorance.
No, absolutely not. That is not an argument from ignorance. To say, we don't know whether or not it was designed, therefore I am not going to make a claim about its state of design, is simply withholding judgment. If it were instead, we don't know whether or not it was designed, therefore it must not have been, then yeah, that would be the argument from ignorance, but I have never heard anyone make such an argument. It's usually more of a, these many biological features don't make any sense from a design standpoint, so it looks like they came about naturally.
And as you just mentioned, we're arguing from what we do know, not from what we don't know. So he's actually got the shoe on the wrong foot here.
No, you are not arguing from what you know. You are arguing from what you think you know, based on intuitions that have demonstrable and severe flaws, and you are backing up this intuition with appeals to things that we haven't figured out yet, which is literally the argument from ignorance. And meanwhile, you're misrepresenting the position to which you are opposed, thereby adding a straw man to your argument from ignorance.
Because how do we detect design? I mean, we do this constantly. There is a criteria that people use in everyday life to detect design.
There are two ways to detect design, intuition and experience. We have experience with things like paintings and buildings. We know where these things come from and we can talk to their designers, so we know that they are designed. We cannot use this method with biological systems, as there does not seem to be a creator that we can just talk to. Well, depending on who you ask. Some people claim to have a personal relationship with this creator, but curiously, nobody has ever been able to introduce me to them. Though I certainly have had people ask me what gives me the right to think that the all-powerful creator of the universe owes me a personal audience. And yeah, if he exists, he doesn't really owe me such an audience. But if you want to claim that he wants to have a personal relationship with me, and one of the foundations of this relationship is that I have to believe that he designed everything, then starting with an audience seems like the most obvious way to go about this. If God can actually show me that he exists, then I will be much more open to the idea that he may have designed biological systems. Though I would still be partial to the design by way of evolution idea, as if he actually directly designed humans as they are now, he sucks. Plain and simple.
And for example, if you had a team of archaeologists or whatever, they're out in the field and they go into a cave, and they look around the cave and they see these pointy rocks. Kind of look like arrowheads or something like that, but they seem to be quite shaped, and there's lots of them. Or they see a bunch of circles, stones put in a circular fashion with some charcoal in the middle or something like that, and then they look on the wall and they see paintings, or they see these scribbly lines, and they don't really know what it looks like, but boy, it looks like a language or something like that.
Yes. See? You're describing things that we have direct experience with. Obviously, though, if you add one more stone to that circle of stones, you'll find a Korok there.
Those would all be natural, logical conclusions based on the evidence you're looking at.
Right.
Because
Yeah.
remember, we're not talking about, they didn't see all those things come to be. They just have happened upon them. Now they got to make a logical decision here.
The decision is based on previous experience. We know that fire pits and cave paintings don't occur naturally, so they would have been caused by an animal of some kind, most likely one of the human species, though exactly which one would depend on other data found at the site.
They would come to the conclusions, I think, that I made based on the fact of the intelligent design that they're witnessing.
And in those specific cases, they would be justified based on past data. What past data do you have that involves a creator designing biological systems? Will they figure out the flaws in their logic? Will they figure out that logical syllogisms are not inherently scientific? And what does all of this have to do with Egyptian hieroglyphics? To find out, tune in tomorrow. Same Rhino time, same Rhino channel.